Hello and welcome to Penguin Book Club. This is a place to come and delve into all those classics you always wanted to read. Today we'll be starting a 3-day celebration of today we are on the second day of our 3-day celebration of Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, which is celebrating its 200th anniversary since publication. I'd like to firstly welcome Susanna Fullerton as our resident queen of the classics at Penguin's Book Club. Susanna has been president of the Jane Austen Society of Australia for the past 18 years. Welcome, Susanna.
Thank you.
I'd also like to welcome Sarah Burns, president of the Australian Bronte Association, and book lover Fred Taylor. Hi, Fred.
Hello, how are we going?
And of course, we'd also like to welcome back book club members watching our Hangout on air. And finally, our very special guest this evening's book club, who's joining us again tonight, is co-artistic director of Bell Shakespeare, John Bell. Welcome, John, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Last night we explored our heroine, Fanny Price, and today we will look at all the other characters of the novel, deep diving a little further into the dastardly Crawfords and the Bertram family. And to start off our book club tonight, I'd like to invite John to start us off with a reading from Mansfield Park.
Fanny, cried Tom Bertram from the other table, where the conference was eagerly carrying on, and the conversation incessant. We want your services. Fanny was up in a moment, expecting some errand, for the habit of employing her in that way was not yet overcome, in spite of all that Edmund could do. We do not want to disturb you from your seat. We do not want your present services. We shall only want you in our play. You must be Cottager's wife. Me, cried Fanny, sitting down again with a most frightened look. Indeed, you must excuse me. I could not act anything if you were to give me the world. No, indeed, I cannot act. Indeed, but you must, for we cannot excuse you. It need not frighten you. It is a nothing of a part, a mere nothing, not above half a dozen speeches together. And it will not much signify if nobody hears a word you say. So you may be as creep mouse as you like, but we must have you to look at. If you're afraid of half a dozen speeches, cried Mr. Rushworth, what would you do with such a part as mine? I have 42 to learn. It is not that I am afraid of learning by heart, said Fanny, shocked to find herself at that moment the only speaker in the room, and to feel that almost every eye was upon her. But I really cannot act. Yes, you can act well enough for us. Learn your part, and we will teach you all the rest. You've only 2 scenes, and as I shall be cottager, I'll put you in and push you about, and you will do it very well, I'll answer for it. No, indeed, Mr. Bertram, you must excuse me. You cannot have an idea. It will be absolutely impossible for me. If I were to undertake it, I should only disappoint you. Pooh, don't be so shamefaced. You'll do it very well. Every allowance will be made for you. We don't expect perfection. You must get a brown gown and a white apron and a mob cap. We must make you a few wrinkles and a little of the crow's foot at the corner of your eyes, and you will be a very proper little old woman. You must excuse me. Indeed, you must excuse me, cried Fanny, growing more and more red from excessive agitation, and looking distressfully at Edmund, who was kindly observing her, but unwilling to exasperate his brother by interference, gave her only an encouraging smile. Her entreaty had no effect on Tom. He only said again what he had said before. And it was not merely Tom, for the requisition was now backed by Mariah and Mr. Crawford and Mr. Yates, with an urgency which differed from his, but in being more gentle and more ceremonious, and which altogether was quite overpowering to Fanny. And before she could breathe after it, Mrs. Norris completed the whole by thus addressing her in a whisper at once angry and audible. What a piece of work is here about nothing! I am quite ashamed of you, Fanny, to make such a difficulty of obliging your cousins in a trifle of this sort, so kind as they are to you. Take the part with a good grace, and let us hear no more of the matter, I entreat. Do not urge her, madam, said Edmund. It is not fair to urge her in this manner. You see, she does not like to act. Let her choose for herself as well as the rest of us. Her judgment may be quite as safely trusted. Do not urge her any more. I am not going to urge her, replied Mrs. Norris sharply. But I shall think her a very obstinate, ungrateful girl, if she does not do what her aunt and cousins wish her. Very ungrateful indeed, considering who and what she is. Edmund was too angry to speak. But Miss Crawford, looking for a moment with astonished eyes at Mrs. Norris, and then at Fanny, whose tears were beginning to show themselves, immediately said with some keenness, "I do not like my situation. This place is too hot for me," and moved away her chair to the opposite side of the table, close to Fanny, saying to her in a kind, low whisper as she placed herself, "Never mind, my dear Miss Price. This is a cross evening. Everybody is cross and teasing, but do not let us mind them." And with pointed attention, continued to talk to her and endeavour to raise her spirits, in spite of being out of spirits herself. By a look at her brother, she prevented any farther entreaty from the theatrical board, and the really good feelings by which she was almost purely governed were rapidly restoring her to all the little she had lost in Edmund's favour.
Thank you so much, John. So, Susanna, we have many characters here. Who shall we start with?
Well, of course, that scene that John has just read us has a great range of characters, and they're all so wonderfully illustrated by Jane Austen so rapidly. We get Mrs. Norris's nastiness, we get Tom Bertram with his enthusiasms, completely ignorant of Fanny's feelings. We get Mary Crawford being very kind to Fanny and championing her. And, of course, all the others who are so desperate to act for their various reasons, mainly flirtation, making love to the right person within the structure of the play, which, of course, Jane Austen handles quite brilliantly within her novel. Lover's Vows was a real play. She herself had seen it performed in the theatre. She uses it with total brilliance within Mansfield Park. But let's begin with the Crawfords, because I think they're important in that scene. They are the charming characters of the novel, but of course they're also the ones that in many ways are much at fault within the book. Fred, you were a first-time reader of the novel. How did you respond to the charm of the Crawfords? Did you feel it? Did you not feel it? Did you feel that they were treated more harshly by the author than you felt they deserved? What was your reaction to Henry and Mary Crawford in the novel?
My reaction, first and foremost, I'll start with Henry. I thought he was just what you call now basically a typical player, in a sense, and it really just sort of plays out a lot through the book. But it reaches a point there where at the end he ends up having sort of feelings and affections for Fanny, and as a reader, you're sort of wondering whether it's actually genuine or whether it's not, as part of that. So I found that quite interesting there from that point of view. And then the sister, Maria, I found also very similar type of character. It was hard to get a grasp on whether they were very genuine or not for a lot of the... and then on top of that as well, a sort of personality whereby she was basically sort of hard to get. She was just trying to sort of tease Edmund a lot of the time throughout.
Rather shallow, isn't she? I think their upbringing has a lot to do with it. You know, they've grown up with an uncle and aunt who have been, well, certainly the uncle, very badly behaved himself. He brings his mistress into the house. It's no wonder their morals have been somewhat damaged in the process of their upbringing. So there's much that's worthwhile about the Crawfords, but at the same time, morally, they're very weak. Sarah, do you think that Henry really falls for Fanny Price, or do you think it's all part of him playing a game?
I think she's a challenge for him, someone to conquest. She doesn't love him, where he's quite used to everyone falling for him and his charms. I don't find him charming at all. But
don't you? No, I want to go into the wilderness with Henry Crawford.
Oh, no. He can be very kind, and that comes out, and he is a witness to the Bertrams and Mrs. Norris not being so kind, and I think he and Mary do have moments where they're very kind to her, but I think they're very shallow.
Yeah. There's an interesting aspect of poaching when it comes to Henry's desire to catch Fanny Price's heart. He talks about her in terms of hunting or poaching, and he says, I want to make a little hole in Fanny Price's heart. It's almost as if she's another sort of bird that he can add to his game bag, his collection of females who have fallen for him. And so I think you're very right, Sarah. He loves the challenge, and the fact that Fanny won't show him any interest really adds to the challenge. It makes him even more keen. But Jane Austen says to us in the novel that he does actually love Fanny, and for a very long time after the novel ends, he regrets what he has lost. And I think had he married her, he'd have become a better man. Whether he'd have been faithful to her is another question. No. I don't know if the good effects would have lasted for the whole of a marriage.
I think she would have been a very good wife.
She would have been, yes.
That would not have satisfied him. She would have kept her home and been good, and he would have known she was always there while he went off and did his travels.
And of course Henry has two women who do fall very deeply in love with him in the course of the novel, particularly Mariah Bertram, but also her sister Julia. Two beautiful girls, sophisticated, very aware of their own importance. Initially they don't find Henry attractive, but very quickly the two of them fall in love with him. So how do you find, Letitia, Mariah's passion for Henry and the way in which she is eventually punished for that at the end of the novel? Do you think Jane Austen is harsh, sending her off to live almost in imprisonment with Mrs. Norris, while Henry, the guy she runs off with, continues to lead a very pleasant life in London?
Well, it's certainly an indictment on the times, isn't it? Because that's exactly how things used to happen. It was the woman who would have to skulk away in shame, and the man would just go on with his, activities, whatever they may be. I think it was interesting. It was an interesting comparison with Fanny. In fact, Fanny could see who this man was, and Mariah just, although she may have suspected he wasn't, a good standing person, someone she should have been involved with, continues down that path against essentially her own misgivings, and just, indulges in her passions. And as we all know, when that happens in Jane Austen's books, that doesn't go very well. And it's that idea again of just not thinking, not reasoning, not looking at everything around you. And I think that's what makes Fanny such an interesting heroine, because she doesn't just go off with her passions. It takes her a long time to get to that point with Edmund at the end of the book.
Another element is the competition between the sisters.
Yes. We're told they're good friends until jealousy comes between them, and eventually, of course, Julia steps back, or
she realizes she doesn't have a chance.
Yeah, so she, of course, ends up with the Honourable Mr. Yates, who loves to rant and rave on the stage. There's that wonderful moment in the book when Sir Thomas comes home and goes into his library and there finds Mr. Yates doing the very best ranting and start of surprise of his entire acting career when Sir Thomas interrupts him. So Julia's not one of the most memorable characters in the novel, and she's given a man who I think is also a very forgettable man in Mr. Yates, so it's probably a suitable fate for Julia. Let's also discuss, from that scene, of course, we have Mrs. Norris being so thoroughly unpleasant to Fanny. Remember who and what you are.
Isn't that awful?
It's a cruel moment in the novel. So Mrs. Norris, is she Jane Austen's greatest villain? Is she Jane Austen's nastiest character? What do you think, Sarah?
I think she is. I think that a lot of the characters in the novels we mightn't like, or they're not the best, but she's nasty.
She's thoroughly unpleasant. Yeah. She's also a thief. She walks home with all sorts of things that she just quietly lifts from Mansfield Park, and she takes them home with her. In fact, I make the claim in my book, Jane Austen and Crime, that she commits a hanging offence by taking home the green baize after the theatricals, which she, of course, has not paid for. She just quietly removes it, and the value of the green baize is such that Mrs. Norris could actually be hanged for what she does. So it's a serious offence. But she's a thoroughly unpleasant character. So, and
she certainly inspired some other interesting characters, because I don't know if you know, but the cat in Harry Potter, Mrs. Norris, was certainly named after this character in Jane Austen's book.
Yes, J.K. Rowling's favourite novelist is Jane Austen, and it's a lovely touch that she named that horrible, snooping, scrawny, ugly cat for Mrs. Norris in Mansfield Park. Now, Fanny, of course, during the course of this novel, goes home to Portsmouth, and there she gets to know the family that she hasn't seen for 8 years. And of course she's got great expectations when she goes home. She's going to see her mother, and she'll be useful to her mother and loved by her. She's going to help look after all the little brothers and sisters that are there. And of course when Fanny gets back to Portsmouth, she actually finds the reality very different, and she starts to long to go back to Mansfield Park. But the Price family is energetic on the whole, the children. William, of course, is having a successful career. Susan is doing well. One of the brothers is becoming a doctor. They're getting jobs. They're doing things, unlike most of the Bertram children who just do nothing. They lead idle lives. So how do you feel about the Portsmouth section of the novel and the way in which Jane Austen uses it and uses the Price family to advance the themes of education and upbringing within the novel? What do you think, Sarah, with the...
I think they're interesting. It's a much busier place, and it's more. We see more of the city of Portsmouth, where Mansfield Park is just a house. You know, we don't see much more beyond the park. Portsmouth's very busy. There's a lot going on. We cringe with Fanny when she comes upon her father. I mean, that must have just been mortifying.
And Jane Austen has that lovely line about any young lady, no matter how much she dislikes her suitor, does not want to be embarrassed by her father in front of her. It's a lovely moment.
Yeah. But she says Portsmouth is Portsmouth and Mansfield Park is home. So the idea of Portsmouth, the longing for home, changes with the reality.
Yes. And I think we can see that Lady Bertram and Mrs. Price are sisters, can't we?
Yes.
There are many similarities between them. And what about William? Fred is a young male reader of the novel. Did you like William? Did you admire him as a character?
I thought he comes across as quite a respectable, really determined character in the book, more so than most of the other male leads in this book, particularly Henry, for example, as well, who would be almost the contrast to what William is. And in fact, I think there was one point in the book too where Henry takes a moment and he sort of regrets that he hasn't really applied himself as much as William has.
Yeah.
So he's essentially becoming a self-made man, obviously with a bit of help on the side from Sir Thomas as well. But he really comes out quite well in the book, I think, and I think he's quite
going into danger, isn't he? He's got a dangerous job, going off to sea and capturing French ships, and he's a young man. He's already had a wealth of experience, and you make a good point that Henry Crawford for a moment is jealous that William has seen all this adventure and done so much. And then he remembers that he's a wealthy man who can own a string of hunters, and he suddenly ceases to envy William Price anymore. But I think what comes through very strongly is how you really needed to know people, didn't you, within the Navy. You've got to have contacts like Sir Thomas, and eventually William only gets his promotion because Henry helps with Admiral Crawford. So it was very much a position of who you know rather than what you know.
And I think that part is very important. Jane Austen wrote to her brother Frank for permission to actually use the ships that he sailed on, and so she was very careful to be authentic and respectful, and so she put a lot of time and effort, I think, into those details.
And William and Susan are likeable characters, aren't they?
Yes.
The Price family, although not all the Price characters are likeable. Little Betsy is very spoiled. Mr. Price, of course, is a ghastly drunk, and Mrs. Price is rather slatternly and lazy. So I think it's a very interesting family, especially in contrast with the members of the Bertram family. So let's move on to Sir Thomas and his wife, who never seems to get off that sofa. Letitia, what do you think of Sir Thomas? Would you want him as your father?
Look, I have to admit, in the first half of the book, I'd have to say no. It took me a long time to like Sir Thomas, and I think in the end, when he's so passionately defensive of Fanny, that you sort of realise the love that he has for somebody who's not his child, and that's quite. I think that takes a lot to do that. So. And he wins me over at that point. And
he learns a lot about himself, doesn't he, in the course of the novel? I think in the last chapter we see him really thinking about his own mistakes and admitting to them and realising that he perhaps has not been the ideal father and how he could have done things differently.
And you do wonder,
sorry, Letitia.
You do wonder whether some of the characters, like Henry, would ever be able to grow into that man and actually say, hey, I made mistakes and I should have behaved better.
Yeah.
Don't think so.
And he is seriously handicapped by his wife. I mean, what is wrong with Lady Bertram that she needs to live on her sofa with Pug, who's one of my favourite characters in the novel, because I'm a pug owner myself. What is wrong with her? She's had 4 babies and she's just taken to the sofa.
Well, Susanna, it's really interesting because Jane Austen does this a lot in her novels. These wives that are, these languishing women and annoying. And why is that? Was her own mother that way, or is it just...
No, her own mother was a very active, practical woman who was always gardening or doing the mending and getting on with things and bringing up her large family of 8 children. And her own mother had a very good sense of humour and wrote comic verse whenever anything important happened within the Austen family. But I guess Lady Bertram was beautiful, and Sir Thomas married her because she had a pretty face, as Mr. Bennet marries Mrs. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. And then he discovers she doesn't have a brain. She's very compliant. She's always saying, what shall I do, Sir Thomas? Tell me what I should do. Will I prefer whist or speculation? Do you think I'd like this, or should I do that? So she's a very obedient wife, but she just has no brain. And, of course, she is useless as a mother. She hands over all her maternal responsibility to Aunt Norris. And that is a big fault within the book, that, she has not done her duty as a mother, and Aunt Norris has managed to get her edge in, if you like, and do all that damage to the various children within the novel.
And Sir Thomas seems to miss that as well, because there's a point in the book too where he starts to realise that anything that Mrs. Norris does is actually, faulty, pretty much.
Yes, and at the end of the novel, he's delighted to get rid of her. But at the beginning, she's very good at flattering him, and clearly he's susceptible to her flattery. So that's how she manages to get her foot in the door. What about Mr. Rushworth? He's one of the great comic characters of the novel, and the piece that John read, of course, emphasised the fact that he has 42 speeches to learn, and he can hardly even learn one of them. And he comes on in a pink satin cloak. So he's a great comic character. But don't we have to feel sorry for Mariah that she has him as a husband? Or do we condemn her that she has gone into that marriage knowing he's a fool, but he's wealthy? He's actually the wealthiest character in all of Jane Austen's novels. And so she marries him for his money. So is he a dupe? Is he badly treated by Mariah? Or is he just a fool that we shouldn't be feeling sorry for?
I don't think. I did feel sorry for him. He's a fool, but he's not one of the cruel characters. And
No.
And I think she did marry him for money, and that's exactly what she got. So I don't feel sorry for her in any way whatsoever. And in fact, that horrible scene when he discovers that, you know, he's been carrying on with Henry, I actually really felt for him.
Mm. Me too,
And
actually.
he is actually able to get a divorce, which was a really rare thing in Jane Austen's world.
No, he wasn't so silly then, was he?
Occasionally managed to get divorces with clear evidence that the wife was unfaithful, but a woman could never get a divorce. That was almost impossible. So Mr. Rushworth is very unusual in being a character in a novel in the early 19th century, in managing to free himself from Mariah. And Jane Austen hints that he might then go on to another marriage with another girl who, of course, will want his money, but might be a bit kinder to him than his wife Mariah was. Sarah, you were talking earlier about, before we started the hangout, about the very important scene at Southerton when Mariah goes around the locked gate. She squeezes round that gate with Henry Crawford.
Yes, through the... At first it's like an imprisonment. I'm trapped. We can't get out. But Henry provides a solution. And she goes through that gate quite easily with his help. And then while her fiancé, the legitimate person with his key, is left behind. And then, of course, Julia struggles through the gate on her own. It's all a bit difficult, and she gets there in the end, but Mariah seems to breeze through with Henry.
Yes.
Over the ha-ha and into the wild.
Into the wilderness.
Yes.
It's a real prefiguring, isn't it, of what will happen later in the novel,
Yes.
when her reputation is torn to shreds,
Yes.
unlike her dress.
Yeah.
She goes out of bounds with Henry Crawford. And, of course, she's followed by Julia, who also doesn't wait for Mr. Rushworth with the key, and who also, of course, at the end of the novel will elope to Gretna Green, also taking the out-of-bounds step when it comes to marriage. So it's a brilliant scene at Southerton with all that prefiguring of what is going to happen later on within the novel.
And with Fanny watching on.
Yes.
We all certainly have to agree that there are some incredible characters in this book, and it's very hard to finish this hangout because we could really be here all night chatting about them all. But unfortunately, our time has come, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for Penguin Book Club today. But luckily, no sad faces, because tomorrow we will continue our celebration of Mansfield Park as we look at the themes of the novel. So there's going to be a lot to talk about then. And we are thrilled to note that John Bell will be back with us to do another reading from Mansfield Park. And we all look forward to seeing you then.
Thanks, Susie. Bye.